with this book, we're really hoping to get people involved in creating habitat, because that is just such an important thing to do. It's one way you can really have an impact, because insects, bees don't, they don't necessarily fly very far. So your tiny little patch can be really significant habitat. If a bee is going to fly 500 meters in its lifetime, you're important. Whatever you do in whatever little 500 meters patch you're stewarding, whether it's at a community garden or a boulevard, a guerrilla garden project, or a backyard or a balcony, it's important. It matters.
Absolutely. Okay, so creating a pollinator garden to me is a bit of a puzzle. You have to put the puzzle pieces together. And one of the big puzzle pieces is, from what I understand, you need blossoms to be continuous throughout the season. Can you tell me about that? Do they need to overlap? What are we aiming for in terms of attracting those beneficials?
Yeah, it is really important to have species in bloom for the whole season. And the reason for this is that different bees have different life cycles and different periods when they are out foraging. Some, like the rusty patch bumblebee, is foraging from, or it is active from spring to fall. So it has a long period, but there are other bees that have very short periods of foraging for nectar, or they have different periods of nesting and different requirements for nesting and all those things. So if you have something in bloom from early spring to late fall, that is ideal. You will be creating the most useful habitat for insects. Because there's something that needs nectar or pollen at all of those times, right? And
absolutely.
Yeah.
So we want a buffet that's going to last the whole season.
Yeah.
Now, we want a wide, at least when you're growing fruit trees, when you're growing vegetables, you want a wide array of bees and pollinators. You want the parasitoids, you want the predatory insects, so that they can do a lot of battle on our behalf. They can go and they can eat the codling moth that might be laying their eggs inside your apples, or all that stuff. We want to have a wide range of beneficials. Now, are there other factors like color, for instance, of the blossoms? Like, tell me about color.
Biodiversity is the most important thing in the landscape, in the pollinator garden, in whatever you're doing. So having this range of flowering times is one aspect of the diversity, but there are many other aspects to it as well. So as you say, color. So having plants with different flowering blooms. I mean, different species of insects are attracted to different colors. I mean, by now, it's pretty well known that something like a hummingbird, they'll really go for the reds in the color. Bees, on the other hand, have trouble seeing that, don't necessarily see that color. So having a range of color in the blooms is also very important. Flower shape is another thing. Height is another thing, or the different materials that stems have. Some stems are hollow, some are pithy, some are full. Like, that diversity is important as well. So just as much variety as you can build into the landscape, the better it is for the whole landscape.
Okay, we've got another email here. Hi, Susan. Wendy from Pennsylvania. Great show. I started changing my garden to natives 4 years ago. It took until last summer for a variety of new insects to arrive. This year shows even greater diversity. Please thank your guest for me. Oh my gosh, Wendy, thank you so much for sharing the process that you've gone through. So Lorraine, Wendy's saying that it took a few years to attract the beneficials. Is that what usually happens?
You know what? In my experience, with native plant gardens is you plant native plants and the creatures will find you, and they'll find you quickly. My very first native plant garden, now it was it's getting on 30 years ago now, was in downtown Toronto, literally a block away from the most major commercial intersection in the city. I planted native meadow plants, sun-loving meadow plants, and I had a hummingbird visit that summer. Right in like the biggest commercial district in downtown Toronto. You plant the native plants and the creatures will find you, and they tend to find you very quickly. Also, I mean, you will be attracting to your spot creatures that might already be close by. So again, that can happen very quickly too. So one thing that can take a bit longer with the native plants is native woodland plants tend to take some time getting established. They're not as fast as the native meadow and sun-loving species. Those are very quick to get established. A woodland garden is going to take a little bit longer, but is of no less importance for pollinators. There's so much you can do in a habitat sense if you have shade as well.
So, Lorraine, let's talk about blossom shapes and some of your favorite plants. Like when I'm thinking about blossoms, my favorite type is like a daisy, like a Shasta daisy shape. What kind of insect would that attract? And what are some of the great native plants that could serve that purpose for us?
Yeah, well, that kind of classic composite flower bloom, a lot of the plants in the aster family that have that shape. Some of the asters that I really, really love for late summer bloom, there's one called like sky blue aster. Sometimes it's called azure aster. It's beautiful, but I love all things blue. But then later, so that's for late summer bloom, but then into the fall, if you have a shady garden, and you're trying to find something that blooms in the fall, it's really hard. But there are some great asters, one of which is the white wood aster, and another is the large leaved aster. And both of them will bloom for a long period in the fall, in shade, and even once they're established in dry shade. And they are great for supporting pollinators. There are a lot of bees and other insects that use the pollen and nectar. Another really important actually maintenance thing or in the native plant garden that's really important to keep in mind for bees is to have a patch of bare ground. I know that in the garden, I have sung the, praise of mulch forever, and I love mulch. It's saved many a garden for me, but it's important to leave some bare earth for ground nesting bees. Leave a lot of standing twigs for the bees to nest in. One thing that I've recently discovered, or not recently discovered, but have started doing a lot more than ever in the past, is leaving beautiful old logs throughout the garden. They look beautiful and they are fantastic habitat. It's incredible the amount of life that there is in the garden when you leave beautiful old logs just scattered around. And you know what? Now in our cities anyway, it's very easy to find after a windstorm to find some, dead log or wood branch to put in the garden.
So we have about just 3 minutes or so left, and then we'll do our contest. But let's just throw out, we talked about daisies, that shape. What's another shape? Like, for instance, I'm thinking in terms of like umbel-shaped flowers, like Queen Anne's lace that looks like a lacy doily. Like what kind of, would that attract a different type of insect than the daisy shape? So maybe we can do Queen Anne's lace and do one more shape before the show ends.
Yeah, sure. So Queen Anne's lace is a non-native plant, but it is actually a larval host plant for some of the swallowtail butterfly. So, so I'll pick another native plant with that umbel shape. So let's say something like an elderberry, that shrub, and that flower shape. The nectar reward, it's very easily accessible for for insects. So it will support hoverflies as well. There was that question about hoverflies. So hoverflies, small beetles, solitary bees. So big nectar reward in that shape of flowers for the pollinators. One I would love to talk about is like a really, okay, so especially since you mentioned the specialist relationships between some bees and some flowers. Let's take the flower shape of something like a monarda or a bee balm, where, I mean, my best way to describe it is like it's a jester's hat. You know, it's an incredible.
Spidery. I find it a little spidery as well, with these wonderful bright red or purple petals. Yeah.
Yes, spurs. It's incredible. So those long nectar spurs can only be accessed by long-tongued bees or hummingbirds or hummingbird moths or hawk moths. So it's something with a long tongue is the only creature that will be getting nectar, but it protects the nectar. That long spur protects the nectar from being robbed or stolen by other insects, because there are insects that do that. But the interesting thing about Monarda is there is a specialist bee whose diet, so it's a small mining bee, and its diet, it's like a pollen specialist on Monarda. So that creature in some ways like is very closely tied to the Monarda plant. So by planting that really interesting shaped flower, which does all these other things and attracts all these other creatures, will also be supporting a specialist bee with that wonderful shaped flower. Then there are also some closed flowers that bees get into.
So what's a closed flower?
My absolute favorite is called bottle gentian. And if you look at it, it's a native plant, incredible blue flowers, and they are like bottles. They're like closed. So a bumblebee has to pry open the blooms and get in there to get the nectar and pollen and then make its way out again. There's just so much to learn about these different shapes and what they tell us about interactions. Flowers that bloom upside down, like some of the lilies.
Yeah. So again, let's say if it's an upside down, or would you say they're bell-shaped, the upside down one? So who would that attract?
So pretty much things like the butterflies, for example, that can get in, that are good at, getting in there underneath, the Turk's cap lily, let's say. Or in the bell-shaped flowers, again, maybe something that's good at with a long tongue and getting in there. But alternatively, something like a catkin, the willows that are blooming in the spring, early spring, when some bees are waking up and need pollen and nectar. Some of the small bees, small-tongued bees, small bees, and flies that can access the floral resources that are so exposed in a flower shape like a catkin. So
fantastic. Wow, you powered through. You got us a whole bunch of shapes. I so appreciate that, Lorraine. You're a star. Because you knew Susan is very interested in flower shapes. She wants her flower shapes. I appreciate that. So I want to remind everybody that we talked about a whole bunch of different things, and there are a lot of resources on orchardpeople.com. So Lorraine talked about bee condos or bee hotels. If you go to orchardpeople.com and you put in the search, you put bee hotel or bee condo or native bees, I have an article where I interview Scott McIver, and we talk a little bit about his study. And I think I titled that, "Do bee condos actually endanger native bees?" or something like that. There are ways to do it, but I give you all the resources. So if you want to do it, or if you want to check you're doing it right, you'll get the resources through that. And thank you so much, Lorraine, for coming on the show today. We really appreciate having time to talk to you, to highlight some of these things, to ask you questions. And I really appreciate that beautiful little free ebook. Just very briefly, will there be a print version at some point?
Sheila and I are working on that right now. So hopefully, but in the meantime, it is available for free download from Friends of the Earth Canada.